and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, we are going to focus on Constance and Isabella of Castile. This week we're doing something a little different. We're covering both Constance and her younger sister Isabella of Castile. They led very parallel lives. The sisters were only 1 year apart, and both of them at 17 married brothers who were also only a year apart, so it makes sense for them to share an episode. If I were to do it separately, it would be two very, very similar episodes, and you would probably get deja vu. So here we go with our first sister episode. Constance of Castile was born in 1354. The daughter of Pedro of Castile, or his nickname, Peter the Cruel. He's come up a couple of times. He was almost the husband of Edward III's daughter, Joan. The circumstances, though, of Constance and Isabella's births are complicated and require a bit of a backstory. So we are going to rewind to 6 years before Constance's birth. The year is 1348, and 14-year-old Princess Joan, the third child and second daughter of King Edward III, was planning to travel to Castile to marry the 14-year-old Castilian heir to the throne. Hashtag goals, when you can find a husband that's the same age as you in the 14th century. But there were stories about a mysterious sickness in Castile. It had killed a lot of people, but it had not made its way to England yet. Joan was unworried about this, and decided to travel to Castile anyways, in hopes of becoming their future queen. Unfortunately, the new illness was the plague, and Joan caught and then died of the plague, before her marriage could even take place. Just 2 years after, the King of Castile also caught and died of the plague, leaving 16-year-old Pedro the new King of Castile. The king is dead, long live the king. For the first 3 years of Pedro's reign, the plague was raging in Europe, but slowly in decline. Very, very slowly in decline. This made not only finding a wife, but also getting her to Castile safely very difficult. This may be why, in 1353, when King Pedro was 19, he chose to marry Maria de Padilla in secret. Now, he didn't need to marry her in secret. He didn't need permission from the king to marry. Pedro was the king. He could give himself permission. But he was only 19 and heavily relied on his advisors and his mothers for what to do. Maria, who was also 19, again, hashtag goals to find a spouse your age, was of noble birth. But it was a Castilian noble birth, and a lower Castilian noble birth at that. The king was expected to marry a foreign princess, hopefully one that came with an alliance. But with all of the plague, foreign princesses weren't easy to find. So Pedro and Maria married in secret, telling no one. Pedro continued to get increasing pressure from both his advisors and his mother to marry into an alliance. So, later in 1353, Pedro was going to get married again, but he was also having a baby with his secret wife Maria, a baby girl named Beatrice. And he married 14-year-old Blanche of Bourbon, the daughter of a French princess. But 3 days into the marriage, King Pedro changed his mind. He left his wife and returned to his first wife and their infant daughter. Unfortunately for Pedro, his second wife Blanche was Queen of Castile and French royalty. They had signed the contract. The main problem here for Pedro is that the papacy had resided in Avignon, France for nearly the last 50 years. The French seemed to have some control over the Pope, and the Pope seemed to favor the French kings. They at least had an unspoken agreement, a friendship maybe. As a Catholic king in Europe, Peter would need the annulment from the Pope to put aside his second wife, and he was unlikely to get that because she was French. So Pedro did the only other thing he could think of. He left his wife and kept her captive until he received his annulment. Like, I'll let her go as soon as you make us not married. If we're married, she's captive. They don't call him Peter the Cruel for nothing. The following year, Pedro and Maria had their second child, another girl. This one named Constance of Castile, half of our subjects for this week. When Constance was only 1 month old, King Pedro again married, this time Juana de Castro. Despite having a secret Castilian wife and a still captive French wife, why not just throw in a third wife? We don't know much about Juana, not even her age, but what we do know is that part of her dower agreement, which is the part of the contract that says, in exchange for her dowry, she will get the title Queen of Castile. But the Pope still hadn't agreed to annul the first marriage to Blanche, who was still Queen of Castile, and in any case, if he had secretly married Maria, his marriage to Blanche was invalid. But I suppose when you have two wives already, then why not add a third? He was already in a bit of a mess he made himself, so he married Juana de Castro, titling her the Queen of Castile. But not too fast. This time, Pedro changed his mind after only 1 day of marriage. Again, returning to his secret wife and new baby. It would almost be romantic if he didn't continue to marry young girls and then immediately abandon them. Peter the Cruel strikes again. And just when you think this mess can't get any more complicated, Juana de Castro finds out she's pregnant after her 1-day marriage. Pedro never returned to Juana and her baby son, who she named John. The same year that Juana had a baby with John, Maria had her third daughter, named Isabella. Isabella of Castile, the other half of our subject for this week. Isabella was soon followed by a brother named Alfonso, presumably after Pedro's father, King Alfonso XI of Castile. Pedro continued living with his secret wife and his 4 children until, in 1361, Maria caught and died of the plague. It was when Maria died that Pedro suddenly confessed everything, announcing his former marriage and making his children, 8-year-old Beatrice, 6-year-old Constance, 5-year-old Isabella, and 3-year-old Alfonso, legitimate, and 5-year-old John, illegitimate. He got the Castilian nobles to recognize Alfonso as his official heir, but little Alfonso, who had been a sickly child, also died when he was just 3, leaving Pedro a single dad with 3 daughters and a son that he never really saw. Peter the Cruel. In 1366, Pedro wasn't just unpopular with the women of Castile, although he was very, very unpopular with the women of Castile. He was making enemies all over, and King Pedro had been challenged for the throne by his bastard half-brother, Henry. And Henry had enough support to depose Pedro, because Pedro was not popular, making Henry the new King of Castile. Pedro and his daughters went to seek refuge with Edward the Black Prince and his wife Joan in Bordeaux. This was the moment from episode 3 when Edward and Pedro teamed up to regain Pedro's throne, leaving Joan in Bordeaux with the children to save the whole day. Now, I don't think it's a secret, I'm not a fan of Peter the Cruel. A lot of people aren't. But I was able to find one positive attribute that he had. Just one. So I'm going to share it because other than this one attribute, he's a fairly disappointing man. During the Middle Ages, European kings were overwhelmingly anti-Semitic, some of them even exiling Jews from their country entirely, expelling them completely. Pedro of Castile supported the Castilian Jews, refusing to exile them. His half-brother Henry used this and the widespread anti-Semitism to depose him, calling Pedro King of the Jews. But Pedro continued to support the Castilian Jews, and then he was deposed. Once the new King Henry was in charge, he promoted forced conversions and anti-Jewish riots all over the place for the next 20 years. The Castilian Jews continued to support Pedro as their king for the rest of his life. And there you have it, the one positive attribute of an otherwise very disappointing man. It was during the struggle for his throne that Constance, Isabella, and Beatrice interacted with the English royal family, mainly Joan, the fair maid of Kent, and her son, baby Prince Edward. Pedro was able to get his throne back, but he was broke and failed to pay his troops, and so he lost it again pretty much just as quickly. The Castilian Jews were then forced to wear stars, indicating not only that they were Jewish, but that they were supporters of the old King Pedro, making them a target for the other Castilians. Peter the Cruel died in 1369, the same year that Queen Philippa died. Peter's oldest daughter, Beatrice, also died that year, leaving 15-year-old Constance and 14-year-old Isabella the last living members in their family. 2 years later, in 1371, Constance was the 17-year-old daughter of a now dead exiled king. And John of Gaunt was a 31-year-old prince looking for his next advantageous marriage. As we discussed before, Peter the Cruel was broke. Constance did not come with any money. What she did come with was potential claim for the Castilian throne. John of Gaunt decided that if he married the oldest surviving daughter of the exiled king of Castile, he would be the new Castilian king. So John of Gaunt married Constance and started calling himself the King of Castile. No one else really called him that. It was just a him thing. He was the King of Castile. He told everybody, but nobody took it very seriously. John's still living governess was now a 22-year-old mother of 4 when her husband, Hugh Swynford, died. The year after 17-year-old Constance married 31-year-old John of Gaunt, Constance's now 17-year-old sister married John's now 31-year-old brother, Edmund. 2 sisters married 2 brothers, both couples with a 14-year age gap. It created a kind of double alliance. Constance, at 19, gave birth to her daughter Catherine in 1373. Catherine, the governess, would have most likely attended the birth of baby Catherine. And that made it all the more awkward when later that same year, Catherine the governess also gave birth to one of John of Gaunt's children, a baby boy named John, presumably after his father. We don't know when that relationship started. I like to think it was after the deaths of both of their spouses, but in either case, it clearly overlapped with his second wife, because his wife and his mistress had babies the same year. That same year, Constance's 18-year-old sister Isabella also had her first baby, Edward, presumably named after his grandfather, King Edward III. Baby John and baby Edward were double cousins, with their mothers being sisters and their fathers being brothers. John of Gaunt only seemed to be married for Constance so he could call himself the King of Castile. Their daughter helped him with that, proving that their marriage was consummated and thus valid and legal. John, at this point, lived with Catherine and the rest of his family, including all of his children that he had had with Blanche, as his main family. Constance lived alone with their daughter Catherine. Now here's where we stop to mention some potentially recognizable names. Constance's baby Catherine would become the great-grandmother of a woman named Catherine of Aragon, King Henry VIII's first wife. If that sounds familiar, that's because Catherine of Aragon was very, very royal, and her ancestors keep popping up. They will continue to keep popping up. She was very, very royal. Constance didn't seem to make any trouble for John, living with and having more children with his mistress Catherine, treating them like his main family. But if you remember, she was the daughter of Peter the Cruel and his secret wife Maria. She started a life as publicly illegitimate, only becoming legitimate after her mother died. She was also the daughter of her father's favorite wife, with his other wives being locked away or abandoned. This wasn't a time when a wife could make a fuss about a mistress and guarantee her own safety. Around this time, Constance's sister Isabella had her second child with John's brother Edmund, a daughter named Constance, presumably after her aunt. But Isabella and Edmund weren't any happier together than their counterparts. It seemed to be an ill match from the very start. Isabella took a different path from her sister, though. Instead of just staying home with her children and being quiet, she decided to go find her own happiness and started an affair. Her new love interest was none other than John Holland. And if that sounds familiar, that's because John Holland is the son of Joan, the Fair Maid of Kent, and her first secret marriage with Thomas Holland. There's a pattern. It is possible that they had gotten to know each other when the Bohun sisters were staying with Joan in Bordeaux. Back then, Isabella was about 11, and John would have been about 14. He may have gone to war with Pedro and Edward, but as second son, he also might have stayed back with his mother. In any case, they started a relationship. Joan was the sister-in-law to both Constance and Isabella. Joan had been married to Edward the Black Prince, who was the brother of Constance and Isabella's husband. So Joan was their sister-in-law. All three women were married to brothers, making her new lover technically her step-nephew-in-law. So they weren't related, but it really was a small world in medieval Europe, and everything really is connected. Back to Constance, now 22, and her daughter Catherine, now 3. Her brother-in-law, Edward the Black Prince, died. Poisoned? Maybe. By her husband? Maybe. We don't know. We'll never know. The fact remained that this left only Edward's 9-year-old son between John and his 63-year-old father's throne. And maybe the daughter of the other older deceased brother, Lionel, but as a young female, she wasn't likely seen as a threat for the throne. The very next year, King Edward III died, making his 10-year-old grandson the new King Richard II. The king is dead. Long live the king. In 1381, 27-year-old Constance was still living alone with her now 8-year-old daughter, Catherine. It's giving me Gilmore Girl vibes. Christopher's off with some other chick. Christopher, or John of Gaunt, as he's named in our story, was also acting as Lord Protector of the realm for his now 14-year-old nephew, King Richard II. But John wasn't doing a very good job, and the peasants revolted. They were very, very angry. When the peasants revolted, they knew where John lived, at Savoy Palace with his mistress and his other children, and Savoy Palace was completely destroyed. They were out to get John. They were looking for him. On one hand, her husband had made the peasants very, very angry, and they were out for blood, literally killing clergy and nobles whenever they found them. On the other hand, he had publicly abandoned her and hadn't been her problem for years, so she was going to lay low and just ride the wave out. Scary situation for sure, but laying low, her husband didn't even flee to her house when his other house got destroyed. He fled to his sister-in-law, Joan, the fair maid of Kent's house, at which point the peasants got up again, and we cover all that in episode 3. Joan's captured, she gets away, it's a whole thing. And John fled to Scotland. Was like, help me, the English people hate me. King Richard was able to pacify the peasants, and we need to remember that he was still only 14. And his uncle, the same one that was supposed to be helping him run the country, fled the country. I think by now we all know I'm not a fan of John of Gaunt. The man was nothing if not problematic. Once things settled, John had his, come to Jesus moment, I think. He was the self-proclaimed King of Castile. Except that was nothing more than a nickname, really. And he was pretty hard fail at being Lord Protector of England, so they weren't going to ask him to be king anytime soon. John of Gaunt decided to return to his wife Constance and their daughter. Why? We don't really know. But as usual, I have theories. A big part of it probably was to protect his true love, his mistress, Catherine. His home and her home had been completely destroyed, and they had been put in danger, grave danger, from the peasants. And the peasants were angry at John. He gave her a large cash payout and returned to his wife, partially protecting his mistress, Catherine. But by now we know John is selfish AF, and he wasn't going to be King of England. That was clear. But maybe he could still be King of Castile, and for that plan to work, he needed his Castilian wife and daughter. They were clearly his plan B. He even had the other English nobles call him my Lord of Spain. Like, he went around requiring people to call him my Lord of Spain. He was giving off Scott Disick vibes, going around saying, I'm the Lord. But he was less the King of Castile than Scott Disick is a lord, because at least Scott Disick he bought that, at least. John was not the King of Castile, but he even signed things, Yo el Rey, Spanish for, I, the King. He was cultural appropriating all over the place. Eye roll. For her part, Constance couldn't have been too happy. It was clear at this point that her and her daughter were no more than tools for John and his ambitions. But Constance did what Constance did best, and she kept her opinions to herself. She probably didn't have to put up with him long. He left for Spain to become the new King of Castile, or at least that's what he was trying to do. In 1385, Constance's sister Isabella was pregnant with her third child. Being in an unhappy marriage and still having a lover, John Holland, there are questions about baby Richard's father. But they didn't have Maury Povich back then to tell them who the daddy was. And just a month after baby Richard was born, Isabella's boyfriend killed someone. He killed a fellow knight. We covered this in Joan the Fair Maid of Kent's episode as well, because Joan begged her son the king to spare her other son, who happened to be Isabella's boyfriend. And then Joan died. We covered the whole thing. Go back to episode 3 if you need a refresher. The king then pardoned his brother. Isabella would have been relieved, and her husband also claimed her baby Richard, so that much was put to rest. He said, yes, this is my child, and that's all it took back then, without Maury. Now is where we take a moment to mention some possibly recognizable names. This little baby Richard would become the grandfather of King Edward IV. John of Gaunt's son with Blanche would become King Henry IV later. And this was his grandfather. He would eventually depose his cousin, King Richard. But we will get to that. Not to be outdone, John of Gaunt's son with his mistress Catherine Swynford would become the grandfather of Margaret Beaufort, who was the start of the Tudor dynasty. The Tudor dynasty is the dynasty that overthrew the York dynasty. The Plantagenet brothers were close in life, only a year apart, and marrying the Castilian Bohun sisters made them closer. But their grandchildren, with 3 different women, would be the cause of the English Civil War that we know as the War of the Roses. But we'll get back to that later. Back to John, King of Castile. He lost, and in fact was not the King of Castile. He kept trying to make it happen, but it was not going to happen. He did manage a peace treaty in which his daughter with Constance, little Catherine, would marry the heir to the Castilian throne, making Catherine the future Queen of Castile. Queen Catherine's great-granddaughter would later marry Catherine Swynford's 3 times great-grandson, King Henry VIII, because it's a small world and everyone was related. Once John married Constance's daughter to the Castilian throne, he decided to again go back to his mistress. For Constance, this would have been a complicated time. Her husband, who I suspect she didn't like very much, had reconciled just long enough to marry their only daughter, whom Constance had a Gilmore Girls kind of relationship with, and then returned to his mistress. This had to be frustrating. On the other hand, her daughter was back in Castile, where Constance had grown up, and was arguably much safer than in England, where the people hated her father. In 1392, Isabella of Castile, Duchess of York, died at the age of 37. Survived by her 3 children, Edward, 19, Constance, 17, and Richard, 7. And her husband, Edmund, remarried the following year. We'll get into that. In 1394, Constance of Castile, Duchess of Lancaster, died at the age of 40, just 2 years after the passing of her sister. Constance was survived by her daughter Catherine, now 21, and the Queen of Castile. Her husband also remarried, but that's another story for another week. And that is where we will leave it until next week. What did you think about the Castilian sisters, Constance and Isabella? Their lives were anything but easy, but they took the lives they were given and rolled with it. And even through their lives, they were undoubtedly difficult. They did seem to find moments of joy. They were far and few between, but they did seem to find small moments of joy with their children. And they stayed strong through it all. You can email me your thoughts at longlivethequeen@gmail.com or find me on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast. Long live to all the modern day queens out there, and until next week, bye.